All right, so my name is Nina Eidsheim. I am professor of musicology and founder and director of the practice-based experimental epistemology research lab, or PEER lab, at UCLA. It's great to see everybody. And again, if you just joined now, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It's been quite a year and quite a week in all possible meanings of those words, but right now, for today, I want to share with you a couple of projects that the PEER Lab has moved forward during this last year. First, in collaboration with Michelle Caswell, Professor Michelle Caswell from UCLA Information Studies, and the LA-based performance and activist organization Great Leap, we have created a model for community organizations and community groups looking to place their archive and the archive of their work. This archival model that we have developed focuses on serving both the local community while also, in the case of Great Leap, recognize their role in the national conversation over the past 40 years, specifically in regards to civil rights and environmental issues. So what many community organizations experience is this conflict between where to put their actual archive. Should it be within the community, and then they would be then left with them having to take care of it, an archive, which is quite a lot of work, versus going to, let's say, a big university like UCLA, where some people might not feel they have the same access as if it was in the community. So we're creating a model where we're able to accommodate for both those needs. So second, the PEER Lab has also just completed a symposium on music and metaphors. And this conversation will be followed up by an edited volume and other events and publications. And if you're interested in information about this ongoing project, you can see the program for the conference, the video archive of the talks, and you can sign up if you want to receive information about the call for papers for the edited volume, which is forthcoming probably this summer. And links have just been posted in the chat for all this. And you can also continuously see what the PEER Lab is up to on the page that will be posted, that was just posted now. So across all our projects, the PEER Lab, pay attention to how oppressed groups and individuals survive, pursue knowledge, and express joy through music and sound. And in doing so, the lab seeks to understand what it is to be human. All PEER Lab work is centered around creative practice. And today's event focuses on the multisensory practice of writing books. Specifically, we have asked the three esteemed authors in today's event to reflect on what sound or music carried them while writing. And to everybody who's here, we ask you also to consider how does music affect the pace or the urgency of your practice? Might it make itself into the shape of the prose or the form of the book itself? How does it change the flavor of your work? Simply, what is the soundtrack to your creativity? And at the lab, we think about our events as family meals, test kitchens, and pop-up labs. And today's event is the family meal. And we imagine this conversation as the one that you could have, that we often have here as we sit under a plentiful table, under an avocado tree in an LA backyard. So imagine what the guests would share as a wonderful dish offered up in such a setting. And before we get started, I want to just offer a few words about how the program will run today. First, I'm going to introduce my dear friend, colleague, collaborator, and co-host for today's event, Professor Martin Daughtry. And Martin is, of course, a very esteemed author himself. Martin will have conversations with each of the authors, one by one. And during that time, if a question or comment pops up into your mind, please feel free to just put that in the chat, and we will return to those questions at the very end when we're going to do a shared Q&A, and we'll also open up for just to be asking questions at that time as well. So I'm now honored and very, very pleased to introduce Martin. J. Martin Daughtry is an associate professor of music and sound studies at New York University. In his writing and teaching, he grapples with an array of themes, including acoustic violence, human and non-human vocality, listening, Russian language sung poetry, the auditory imagination, extraterrestrial musicalities, and jazz. His monograph titled Listening to War, Sound, Music, Trauma, and Survival in Wartime Iraq, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015, received the Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers and the Alan Merriam Prize from the Society for Ethnomusicology. He's a founding member of the Analog Humanities Archive and Symposium. Their acronym is AHAS, an enigmatic organization that by design has no internet footprint. Quite a feat, Martin. Daughtry is currently writing a book on voice and atmosphere in the Anthropocene, so very, very relevant. He's the best. I couldn't think of a better moderator for today's event. And before I pass it off to Martin, I want to thank the UCLA School of Music and Peer Lab teams who have worked behind the scenes to make this event possible. And as a land grant institution, we also want to acknowledge the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of this region. So Martin, thank you again for being here, and I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
Nina, thank you so much. It's just a great pleasure to be here with you and with the authors and with everyone here today. I'm coming at you from a university that sits on ancestral Lenape homelands and a neighborhood that was once called Little Africa. I'm also coming to you from a very diverse and complex city that has the largest urban native population in the United States. And I'm, happy and just thrilled to be here. I'm here as, I guess, a kind of a moderator, or as if this is a family meal, I'm maybe the guy who begins passing the plates. So I'd first like to introduce our three participants today. I'm going to introduce them all at once, and then I'm going to kind of queue up a few questions provided by Nina for them. So first on the docket is Dr. Jessica A. Schwartz. Jessica is an associate professor of musicology at the Herb Alpert School of Music at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her work focuses on critical, creative, and poetic dissent through an interrogation of sonic histories and musical representations of imperial and military violence. These themes are explored in her monograph titled Radiation Sounds, Marshallese Music and Nuclear Silences, which was published by Duke in 2021. Professor Schwartz has published related work in the journals American Quarterly and Women in Music, as well as work on DIY and punk musicality, philosophy, and education in the edited volume Punk Pedagogies, Music, Culture, and Learning, and in the journal Punk and Post-Punk. Dr. Schwartz is the co-founder of and academic advisor to the Marshallese Educational Initiative. She also hosts the Punkcast series, which is available for your listening pleasure on Spotify. Second is Dr. Jessica Bissett-Perea. Dr. Bissett-Perea is a Dena'ina musician scholar whose indigenous-led and indigeneity-centered work advances radical and relational ways of being, knowing, and doing to generate more just futures for indigenous communities. Her book, titled Sound Relations, Native Ways of Doing Music History in Alaska, which was also published in 2021 by Oxford University Press, delves into Inuit musical life across a range of genres, from hip hop to hymnody, from drum songs to funk and R&B. The book seeks to amplify the significance of sound as integral to indigenous self-determination and resurgence movements. Dr. Bissett-Perea currently works as an associate professor of Native American Studies at the University of California, Davis. And in the third position, we have Dr. Marina Peterson. Dr. Peterson is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. Her work attends to elemental forces and shifting modalities of matter, exploring diverse and innovative ways of encountering and presenting the ethnographic. Dr. Peterson's most recent work, titled Atmospheric Noise, The Indefinite Urbanism of Los Angeles, which was published by Duke in 2021, traces environmental noise, atmosphere, sense, and matter, revealing how these forces cohere in and through noise pollution legislation and the politics of airport noise in the 1960s. The book illuminates key ways in which noise amplifies how we sense the atmospheric and how we make sense of it. Dr. Peterson has co-edited books on anthropology and art and is co-director of the Bureau for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Texas. An accomplished cellist, her improvisational practice experiments with sonic textures and materialities. I honestly can't think of 3 more exciting monographs to have come out in the past 2 years, or of 3 more exciting scholars for us to talk to and learn from. Together, their work demonstrates how expansive, creative, and deeply socially engaged music studies and sound studies and anthropology can be. So let's get started. Now, the rather poetic question that will structure our conversation, the kind of question, was formulated by Nina, and it goes like this: what was the soundtrack to you writing your monograph? Now, a question like this is kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It seems like a kind of a straightforward singular thing, but if you fiddle around with it, you find out it also contains a corkscrew and a pair of tweezers and a toothpick or some other appendage. So we might begin and end with the question as formulated, but these people and I might also unfold a few other questions along the way. So we will begin in the order introduced with Jessica Schwartz. Jessica, hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Great to see you.
Great to see you too. And thanks to everybody for being here, and Nina and the Peer Lab. Wanted to stress my solidarity in stating that I am situated on and coming from Tongva land as well, and looking forward to having this conversation. I'm gonna open my keynote right now. And Martin, understanding it's a conversation between you and I'm going to take a quote from my dissertation that turned into the book that really structured the soundtrack to writing. And you reminded me of it the other day when I was at your seminar. So please bear with me. Okay. Let's see here. All right. The violent inaudibility of the bomb, that has been the soundtrack, and thinking through as this advertisement from World War II, thinking about the aftermath of World War II, speaks to creative destruction in my mind. And what are the sounds of creative destruction, and also the expressions that counter and challenge that creativity as creativity themselves. So in working on radiation sounds, thinking about the violent inaudibility of the bomb, thinking about the core of the bomb that vaporizes and compresses life and then radiates and resonates outwards, these silences and silencings, I really wanted to think about, just the ways in which these silences and silencings are part of larger, both atomic auralities and also the ways in which atomic auralities are the kind of divisions between what we hear and what we can hear, are part of larger architectures of ignorance around being unable to hear certain voices. So I was just listening to kind of anything and everything from the so-called atomic age. My my advisor, my dissertation, Hiram Moreno, asked me to do, I was really, as Martin said, I was into punk. Spent my formative years in punk, and Hiram Moreno suggested that I do a genealogy of punk through rock and roll, specifically looking at the problematic racial dynamics in the music industry and in the genre of rock and roll that has been appropriated, obviously, and whitewashed. So this led me to some songs and some sounds of the 1950s. I'm just gonna play a little.
Listen and learn through civil defense. This is Johnny Cash.
I remember how the siren was bursting into my brain, how it sounded as it began to stop. The gurgle of a death rattle.
So these are part of the, US productions. So is doo-wop, so is rock and roll around this time. And they're the erasures of indigenous lives and lands and listenings that retain spectral presences in the grooves of rock and roll. And these grooves of rock and roll are the spectral sonics, I believe, in radiation sounds. And that leads us, Martin, to a question that I believe you formulated, if you'd like to ask it.
Sure. This is a question that is, I think, nestled kind of underneath Nina's questions, which is what music or sounds haunt or echo within your monograph?
So Bob Dylan said in this interview with Bill Flanagan, quote, "Rock and roll made you oblivious to nuclear fear, busted down the barriers that race and religion ideologies put up. We lived under a death cloud. The air was radioactive. Doo-wop was the counterpart to rock and roll. Rock and roll was atomic powered. It didn't seem like an extension of anything, but it probably was." And as I was saying, I was led through a genealogy of punk to the song Shaboom, an African-American band, The Chords. And this doo-wop song becomes appropriated by a white Canadian band, the Crew Cuts, their militaristic, name. And I thought about, okay, there's one line of appropriation. The story of Shaboom, and I'm going to play the song in a second, is such that the lead tenor Jimmy Keys and his band are watching the explosion at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, the 1954 thermonuclear detonation, Castle Bravo, and they want to sound this awesome power of the bomb. And I thought, well, if there are songs, American songs that want to sound the awesome power of the bomb, what about songs from Bikini Atoll? So I kind of used this connective notion of appropriation, appreciation, various modes of connection to think about the pivot. And that led me to the Marshall Islands, but this is very much part of the soundtrack, Shaboom. Whoops. Let's see if it plays.
Life could be a dream. Shaboom, if I could take you up in paradise up above. Shaboom, and tell me, darling, I'm the only one that you love. Life could be a dream. Sweetheart, hello, hello again. Shaboom, and hope we meet again. Boom, boom, boom.
Crew Cuts.
Like when the Crew Cuts first burst on the scene with their classic, Shaboom.
Life could be a dream. If I could take you up in paradise up above.
And this led me to a website hosted by Jack Niedenthal, who's the Bikinian liaison at the time. And there was a portion of the Bikinian anthem, which is a song of mourning, a lament, written in 1946 by Laura Kesabuki at the time of the forcible relocation by the US government. So I started hearing the bomb in many different places. But as I was writing, I was really invested in listening to Marshallese music that in my 2 years in the Marshall Islands and subsequently in the United States in Springdale, Arkansas, I had, people had shared with me. And I wanted to hear it in concert with contemporary, quote unquote, contemporary US popular music. The Bomb presents itself in a myriad of different genres. I started hearing it everywhere. And again, well, this goes to the second question, I guess, Martin, if you want to.
Before we get to the second question, can I just kind of pause and rewind for a second, because it took me a while to wrap my head around this when I was encountering your work as you were writing it as a grad student. So I think it might have just blasted by our audience.
Yes.
The song Shaboom and the word Shaboom is not just another doo-wop, kind of nonsense syllable. You're saying that it was intended to evoke atomic testing.
Yeah, it's onomatopoeic in that sense. It's trying to sound that awesome power of the bomb.
And that's not a reading that you make, that you're kind of, inscribing onto it. That is something that the
lead tenor
originators of the song had in mind, right?
Right. He said in a CNN interview, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And actually, thank you for bringing that up, because as the so-called the so-called first rock and roll song, because of it was considered a crossover song, right? The first R&B song to be on the pop charts. So it becomes looked at as one of the first, yes, it's doo-wop, but also rock and roll, an early rock and roll song. And in that respect, in that crossover respect, those onomatopoeic syllables become foundational, I think, to popular music, thereafter, and especially in the United States, kind of imperial globalizing of its pop culture in ways that become picked up, throughout the world, including in the Marshall Islands. So
yeah, it's just,
I hear those kind of syllables too, as going outwards.
Yeah, to think that, both that kind of the atomic era is kind of like this sinister nucleus at the, sitting at the very center of, or at the beginning of rock and roll, as you're saying, but that it so quickly kind of became, I don't know, lost that significance, lost that reference point in I think, just the mainstream American auditory regime. I don't think that many listeners, I don't know about listeners then, you would, based on the research that you did, but I grew up with that song, never once suspecting that it was, at any point in its history evoking, the atomic age or atomic, an atomic explosion. Do you know what I mean? I just heard it as doo-wop.
No, definitely. And I think that that's the case for a number of songs. We don't hear the aural environment that shapes and informs the songs, right? The soundtracks to creativity of the creativity that is, say, the popular music that then becomes the soundtracks to our own creativity, which is why I wanted to start off with that.
But that's another kind of inaudibility, right? And
exactly.
not like laid atop the violent inaudibility of the bomb,
right?
Right.
Yeah, because then what happens, and that's where that pivot comes in, right? We can look at the violent appropriation that the White Canadian band, takes, because their song becomes more popular than so they're getting, more cultural investment from this, global means of violence. But then if you cross over the Pacific and pivot, whose voices are, again, effaced and erased in the material vaporization of lands and, in the making of that sound. the making of those silences. We turn to, the Marshall Islands, not exclusively the Marshall Islands, but in terms of the book that obviously I wrote, focusing on the Marshall Islands.
So that leads, I guess, fairly elegantly to a kind of a corkscrew question. That is, when you were writing the monograph, what music was on your mind or on your turntable?
The Marshallese music that I heard. I couldn't stop listening to a song, Union Miari, about, from when I asked about bomb songs in the Marshall Islands, I kept hearing about this song from World War II. And again, thinking about that idea that after total war, can be this idea of like total freedom that the US was selling. When this song to me is another pivot. It's written by Aleros, a female chief who was taken from her home atoll and placed in the Japanese center of Jelowitz in a leper colony. And she was imagining and predicting all this violence done to her and her homeland kind of in the same breath. And I heard landowners on Kwajalein, the military base, sing this song. And I would play it again and again and again as I was writing. And I couldn't get out of it. And to me, it evokes, and I'll just play a bit of it. I feel like we might be out of time.
We are, lamentably, but let's definitely hear a little bit.
Okay, so yeah, I wanted to play just a little bit of this because this really, I kept going back to this as, again, a kind of foundational song. So basically, and I'm going to end on that, the letters Labo was talking about, and the lyrics are talking about, the crunching jets and the shooting bullets and the scattering of these violent mechanisms, things that are manifesting, and then she has nowhere to go. So again, that kind of imagination of freedom and then the taking of freedom that is part of these larger archives of post-war sound that inflect our popular music today that I was listening to. So thank you. Thank you for that conversation.
Thank you so much. Please stay on the line. I think there'll be a chance for us to kind of return and speak as a group at the end of this event. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for writing such an important and illuminating book. All right. It's now my pleasure to turn to Jessica Bissett-Perea. Jessica, are you with us? Hi.
Hello, hello.
Oh, hello. So I guess we're going to start. I'll just remind the audience that your monograph, which came out in 2021, is titled Sound Relations, Native Ways of Doing Music History in Alaska. So what was the soundtrack to you writing your monograph? What musics or sounds haunt or echo within it?
I think that, and I'll also kind of start by way of some sounds that, because I think for maybe all three of us, that at least my book, I can say, became a pandemic passion project because it finalized during the pandemic. I remember I submitted the final draft on the day the sky turned orange here in California. And a lot of folks, learn to make sourdough bread and things, but one of the things that I learned to do was to introduce myself in the Dena'ina language. And so I'll just say a couple of words here just as a one of the things that was very much in my ears and on my tongue, thinking about multisensorially, right? But one way I introduce myself is Yale Du, Jessica Bissett Presh Ilakidan, Dana Ina Dekishna Shlanshida, Shaldina related Anna Shlanshida, Kanakatna Shlanshida, and Kanakatna Shugu Shiga Kalanda. And what I say is my name and that I am a Dena'ina woman. My mother's people are the people of the mountains. I'm a Kanik tribal member and from the Upper Takatnu Kukinut peoples. And that in terms of lands that I've gone through that have nurtured this project, I currently live in Huichin, which is also known as Berkeley, California. I work on Putatoy, which is also known as Davis, California, traditional Patwin lands. But the seeds of this book began in LA, what is known as LA today, Tovangar, Gabriel and Tongva lands. And I see that my dissertation advisor is on the call, Olivia Bleckel, that this project really began in the musicology department there. And so in addition to kind of my pandemic passion project and thinking about the kinds of things that preoccupy me as an Alaska Native in diaspora living in California now for 15 plus years, that so many people don't know what anything sounds like in the Arctic in terms of Inuit or Alaska Native musicking. And so much of what I feel like I tried to do in this book was to really get at those notions of absence as silence or presence as sound. And I want to share kind of in the spirit of what Dr. Schwartz was sharing. I have a quote that I like to use here, and I'll play it here. So this is these are some of the album covers from the book, and as you mentioned in the description or my introduction, that the book goes everywhere from, if we start in the upper corner, from kind of gospel hymnody from Chupik musicians Henry and Hilma Shavings, to country western with John Gayak and Joe Paul, to a resurgence of Yupik drum dance musicking from Chuna McIntyre here and Across the Tundra, and more recently with Byron McIntyre with his kind of leading a youth movement, resurgence movement. But the bulk of what was always in my ears from growing up as a teenager in Alaska to the work I did at UCLA and the book itself is Bumyua. Bumyua is really one of the core bands that was where I first felt like I heard my own experience in sound. And so my own kind of hauntings being trained in music or music history was an absence of that so much of what we learn about Native North Americans in particular, if we even talk about Alaska Natives or Inuit more specifically, that there's just a suspicious or conspicuous absence or silence there. And with Bumyua, I feature them in the 4th chapter. That's where I kind of use what I'm calling a sound relations model to get at the kind of multisensorial time-space simultaneity of the layering of intergenerational sounds and sound relations, as I theorize in the book, that come from this the epigraph. Oh, this is the wrong one. This one. This is the epigraph in the book. I apologize. So our ancestors used to say, "Tluka kalamuk yuitik," the world is populated by no one else but relatives. And that's a guiding quote that really informs the way, certainly, that indigenous logics frame their world and reality, and that there were many times when you would hear indigenous Christian hymnody or indigenous tribal funk or hip hop, right? That, is that really native? Is that really indigenous? And that kind of questioning of our humanity, of our identities as multi-layered and dense are really what drove me. So, I mean, it's kind of my own haunting of just like this idea that colonial ways of knowing want to contain and measure us, whereas obviously the creative arts and performing arts exceed colonial expectations and measurements. And so the book is really just kind of a love ode to all of these albums, and these were the only ones I could contain within one book, and that there's obviously a lifetime worth of work to get to in terms of getting to even more information about the other densities that aren't even talked about in the book.
Yeah, that love really comes through in reading the book. You do a lot of very sophisticated work within the book, but I feel like you also are probably felt obligated to do some kind of remedial work. You know, I saw a lecture of yours online in which you did this kind of amazing move where you Googled the term Arctic and just, you know, every single photograph was basically white and devoid of people, and maybe had a polar bear in it. And you know, the extent to which the book really kind of smashes any mistaken notion that we might have of imagining the Arctic in terms of indigenous absence or silence. You know, you are kind of populating it with you know, continuous sound, and that's just really kind of extraordinary. And it's sad that we need that, but we definitely need that.
Well, here's that image for you.
Yeah, oh, there it is. Great.
That it's one that I love to share. It says a lot.
Totally blew my mind, and I felt very chastened. You in the book, you draw a really important distinction, I think, between listening to and listening for. So I think another question that we can kind of pull out of the soundtrack question is not so much what were you listening to as you wrote, but what were you listening for as you wrote?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of all of these words in terms of shifting the research from on and about Native musicians or Native peoples to with, by, for is like a massive thing that preoccupies most of the book. But I think there's a great, you know, it's just you're able to get at more of the density when you think about listening to could be sometimes maybe thought of on the surface level, whereas for, what I'm listening for are those relationalities, or, you know, why Christian hymnody? What are the histories behind that? How do these electric guitars get out in the tundra? How, you know, why would you know, young musicians in the 21st century allied themselves or put themselves in relation to these musics like hip hop and funk that are very much coded as Black in American history for good reason. But it's these kind of internationalisms or these imagined and very real and concrete relationalities that come to the fore when you, instead of stopping at the question, is this Native or is this not? You know, that's not what the book is about. The book is really about getting at the many ways in which it's possible to be Native. And so, yeah, you're right. Your earlier comment about kind of some remedial things about what indigeneity is or is not, or what it could be, are certainly things that I haven't seen much in print. And luckily, I'm not the only one working on this. We all know Dylan Robinson's Hungry Listening is also another book that does very different kinds of work. So I'm glad that we have at least the two of us now making things more complicated. So yeah, listening for could also, now I'm thinking about with and through, right? And thinking about how Black feminist science writers are talking about relationality. And so thinking outside of even just indigenous logics. Yeah, it's super important because I don't think it's something we're trained to do as musicologists.
Yeah. Is there a temporal dimension, do you think, to listening for? It seems to me like listening to might be more oriented toward, I don't know, what is there to the present, and listening for seems to have almost a future orientation, you know, toward it, which leads me to yet another question we can pull out of the soundtrack question, which is, what, if any, sonic utopia does your monograph point us toward? What listening positionality
I think in terms of,
do you want your readers to occupy?
Yeah, the whole idea of radical as rooted and relational as everything and everywhere are really core. And just to be, the utopia for me would be a less attention to needing to measure and contain things, and to be more dense and capacious with how we encounter peoples that we might understand as different from ourselves, instead of recognizing the humanity in all of us, as well as the peoplehood of more than human relatives, right? So in terms of utopias, it's really just thinking beyond the kind of human-centric way that we're always taught in Western logics to really think just density is kind of the key word of I feel the book.
And a huge contribution that the book makes. I had never thought about that. You know, I thought about density maybe in terms of kind of as something that is evoked by thick description, but your treatment of density and placing it kind of in relation with or contradistinction to the term difference was really, really useful. Could you, you know, for the audience, maybe unpack your use of density a little bit?
Yeah, briefly, because I think we're also running out of time. But the idea of density, we're all very familiar with diversity, equity, and inclusion movements, right, in our kind of neoliberal institutions. And so what that usually ends up looking like is tokenism. So you might have Indigenous, Black or brown bodies in advisory boards or whatever, but it really gets to the logics and the kind of letting differences stand. I think there's always a hesitance in our societies to move away from conflict or move away from argument or debate, when really what instead of legislating one way or the highway, the thing that is really important, especially in Indigenous communities where we are so measured and contained and we are held to impossible standards of authenticity, that to make space for a density of ways of being, knowing, and doing that are still enacted in ways that are responsible, respectful, reciprocal, and all of these kinds of R's that we hear a lot in Indigenous studies. But yeah, that density moves away from difference and diversity and towards something much, much more liberatory. And that comes out of Robin D.G. Kelly's work, who's at UCLA, and then Chris Anderson's kind of reformulation of that for the density of our Indigenous being. So the soundtrack to your monograph, like how would you in 30 seconds relate it to density? Well, it's the discography, right? In the book, it's all of those different genres and all of those. I mean, is so-called one cultural area, and again, I'm not you pick myself, but just that within one so-called cultural area, that there's just an immense amount of different ways of expressing what it means to be alive in the 20th and 21st century, and so and all the complexities of colonialisms and all the other isms that's a kind of cacophony that I can get behind.
I love it. Thank you so much, Jessica. I urge everyone to read your book multiple times and stay with us while I bring Marina Peterson to the floor. And I will remind the audience that Marina's volume that we're here to discuss is titled Atmospheric Noise, the Indefinite Urbanism of Los Angeles. Hi, Marina.
Hi.
Hi. You're reaching us from the road, is that correct?
From the road. And I could say also as a land acknowledgement that it is Cahuilla territory where I am, and otherwise in a photo booth, which was the quietest place I could find.
And it's a broken photo booth, right?
A photo booth.
So the oculocentric regime is defunct right now, and we'll be listening to you in a broken photo.
And it's maybe the only place without a speaker, above my head. So that was the reason for coming in here. So thank you for bearing with me and the patience with it, but it was potentially difficult situations with me zooming in. But I'm really, really, really happy to be here. I mean, really, actually, just honored to be invited to the table, as it were, with these other two amazing scholars, the two Jessicas, Jessica Swartz and Jessica Correa, whose work is just amazing and groundbreaking. And so I'm really, really, really delighted to be here. Do you want to start with the question?
Sure.
Before I go? Okay.
So you and I agreed that I would ask you the kind of baldest formulation of the question, what is the soundtrack to you writing your monograph?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. It's an interesting problem in relation to my book, and maybe we'll get to that when we ask sort of the more pointed question at the end. For me, what I came up with in answering this or in thinking through this is the ways in which I was engaging with sound as phenomenal and sound as sound as a phenomenon in relation to other forms of matter, especially air, but not only, and as a way of, thinking through, working through a kind of, immaterialities, right? A kind of a textures of immateriality. And that said, a book takes a really long time to write. I think, so there's a long, long arc to this. And the research began when I was living with a 2-year-old whose perception of a phenomenal world was still emerging, and when everything was potential sound. And so I really actually I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to be a little bit self-indulgent and share a video of my son. Oh, I have to share my screen to do that too. Let's do this.
And you'll click on the share audio box, right?
Thank you for reminding me of that. Okay.
Using drum text. Jumping.
I love that so much.
Yeah, so this nicely pops up every year on Facebook, and I get to re-engage with this. But also, I mean, it really is true that actually my work at that point, a lot of it had come out of that, being close to that experience of a kind of emergent perception of a world, and then how that mattered for thinking about sound. So actually, an article prior to my book on emergent sound that I was trying to kind of think through, music more properly music rather than what airport noise as my book became, but in terms of something that is always emergent, and to kind of destabilize some of the the kind of solid artifacts of records or scores or whatnot, and so I think that the book then became an outcome of that, but also moved, I guess, right, in a little bit in the way that also the perception, a child's perception changes and becomes a little bit more outward and encompassing. The next thing that I wanted to share were these wind noise recordings that I made, and this was part of my research, and as I, in engaging with the acoustic engineering and noise monitoring and measurement and all of the kind of ways of fixing noise or accounting for noise, became kind of concerned with the materiality of the microphone, and actually what the work that the microphone was doing, and the way in which the microphone was treated as transparent. And so as part of my investigation of that, I went actually to the flight path, under the flight path, and made wind noise recordings. So wind noise is the thing that everybody tries to keep out of their recordings. And I made them with intentionally catching the not just a sound of wind, but all the pops and buzzes and disturbances that the wind does to the microphone, or the way the microphone is responding to the wind, as a way of treating that and really actually investigating that. So I'll place a couple of these. I'm trying to find the, if I'm in here, let me spell this. Okay, sorry. Here we go. So. So so for me, actually, I want to put those in relation to writing as they really are an investigation, and also something that helped me then think through some of the ideas that I then wrote about in relation to different aspects of the work that sound was doing in this case. So sound as touch, sound as, the relation of, right, as I said before, the kind of, sound and other forms of matter, the air, and deep kind of revealing those things that often are invisible, inaccessible, especially air, something like air, but here the microphone. One of the works, not my own or not so close to home, that then was useful for this is Toshiya Sonoda's Pieces of Air. So he's a sound artist, and he's one of the few that I found that was actually also, again, really explicitly amplifying or treating air as something that was doing work in relation to sound. And so that was something that I was listening to. I wrote a little bit about another song that came into the book is the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations, which has an interesting kind of, multiple resonances across with this material. So they lived under the flight path of the Hawthorne Airport. And, but it also, the song kept coming to me when I was actually, working on the chapter on soundproofing and thinking about, okay, there's all this work on entanglements, all this kind of, it's valued. We kind of tend to, love the ways of thinking, things together, relations and everything's together. And here's a case where, there's an explicit effort to curtail those entanglements, right? To make barriers and to actually then have to take seriously something like unwanted entanglements. So at this, I had this song, Good Vibrations, in my head, because actually it's like, how do we grapple with this? This is of that moment, but it's also, it's doing this, it's sort of a theme song for actually I think a lot of the work that, most of us are doing right now, right? In terms of thinking about the kind of thinking relations in different ways. And then it turned out that they actually lived under the flight path, and that I
was going to say there's no more site specific.
Yeah. And then so they actually had so in making actually sound making the kind of interior soundproofed sound that they then are famous for, right, actually was generated by aircraft noise or in relation to aircraft noise. And then you mean
the anechoic material that?
Yeah, like the fact that they are they ended up putting mattresses in their windows, and then doing the studio sound that they're famous for, right? Everything kind of going through a device and not actually in the air has actual relationship to their experience of aircraft noise.
Because they were so close to LAX at the time?
Yeah, actually Hawthorne Airport.
I see.
Yeah. So, which is a smaller airport a little bit east, but actually people who live in Hawthorne at this point are under the LAX flight path. So, now currently. And then I guess I wanted to just say that, in the end of writing, when I was finishing or reading proofs, that all I could read was poetry. And to me, this also is another way of thinking of a soundtrack, because, how to attend to language, rhythm, sounds and relations, and especially poetry then it's treating the phenomenal or treating relations across scale. People like Cole Swenson, Peter Gizzi, Meme Berzenberger, Edel Adnan. So these are the kind of, and I would add that to a soundtrack.
Definitely. I think when one begins to get preoccupied with poetry, it's a sign that the book is almost finished. I have to say, your air recordings pull me in so many different directions. You mentioned that one sound artist. It also made me think of the indigenous sound artist Raven Chacon, who has, his recordings of wind that intensify the mediation effect, by kind of forcing the clipping of the sound device and being a kind of argument in sound about many things, among them mediation. And it also reminds me of like wind recordings are kind of the only sound recordings that we have that we have a kind of an extraterrestrial archive of them, right? We've got American-made wind recordings on Mars, and the Soviets made recordings of winds on Venus. So we have Venusian wind, Martian wind, earthly wind, the wind outside LAX, and it all sounds the same. It all sounds like microphones being overwhelmed. So there's speaking of relationality, maybe if we end on a kind of a note of relationality, that maybe gets us eerily, your wind recording gets us there. Thank you so much, Marina. It's an absolutely brilliant book that that rewards multiple readings, I have found, and I'm as with the other two, I'm inspired by it. I am super inspired by the constellation of these books. And if we had, you know, another meal to have together, we would talk about the really interesting ways in which all three of your books are entangled, and the threads that kind of that connect them, and the common winds that blow through them. But we'll have to, that work will have to be done by the audience out of time. You'll need to read these three books, and you'll need to make those connections. And I hope that you all do that. I mean, I can't think of any better way to spend your time. Nina, I'm turning the microphone back to you, I think.
I think we'll do this together, Martin. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So if you have any questions for each other, I mean, because this is such, you know, it's not always possible that books come out around the same time that are so entangled or so much in conversation with each other, but also so unique in terms of the location and the particular sounds you're working with. I'm curious what kind of relationalities you have or haven't experienced with between your works. And also, Martin, you know, like this is like I said, you're just the perfect person to have this conversation with the three authors, as you are moving into you are in the midst of your project as well. So maybe we'll just, can I start, Martin, by just asking you to say a few words about what you are doing right now, even though it was a little bit in the bio about that. And then we'll get people ready for their questions in that way.
Yeah, I have for the last embarrassing number of years been very slowly working on a book that is ostensibly on voice, but it's a book on voice that takes air seriously. So it's a book on voice that attempts to kind of prevent air from being pushed into the background while we consider voice. I'm holding air not as an abstraction or as a monolithic thing, but as the actual Earth's atmosphere that is variously seeded, charged with anthropogenic and other particles, as an entity that engages in radical sharing, global sharing, but also in weird kind of territorializing, right? There are some particles that the atmosphere distributes globally, and there are others, heavier ones, that stay, more or less near where they are. And I'm trying to kind of think about what vocality might be if we maintained a focus on movements of air and not just the kind of vibratory sounds. So that, I'll say Jessica Schwartz's book was one of the earliest inspirations for my project. And it was one of the only, at the time that I started, long before your book came out, but after I had read your dissertation and participated in your dissertation defense, your book and Nina's work were, I think, the only two, works within like a broadly considered voice studies that didn't collapse voice down into its kind of sonorous dimension. Jessica's book very kind of heartrendingly documents the effect on the bodies and vocal apparatuses of Marshallese people who were irradiated, and so there the air is not, cannot be pushed into the background, and Nina's entire project regarding voice kind of amounts to this refusal to allow us to kind of think of the voice as only sound. So you know, it's very, very appropriate. And then I met Marina and began reading her work, and found air to be present and kind of treated as an active entity in a way that was very complementary to what I was trying to do. And I've, you know, Jessica Bissett-Perea, I've been introduced to your work most recently, but I too am, you know, kind of really, really inspired by the way that you treat sound density and relationality in ways that are, you know, seeming to like cause other parts of my project to kind of to morph. So yeah.
Thank you, Morgan. And when your book is out, we'll have to ask you about what was the soundtrack to your creativity, to your writing book.
If it ever comes out, yeah.
It will. So if you have a question, please feel free to just raise your Zoom hand or just turn on your mic or write it in the chat. I have some questions to you, each of you, but I wanted to give you the chance to ask each other if you have something on your mind. But otherwise, I do have a question for each of you. All right, I have to be quick here. So this question is the same for each of you. We have been talking very both concrete and abstractly, but about the kinds of sounds that I think invigorated and was kind of like the engine to your thinking and doing the work. I'm wondering just very, very concretely, when you were sitting down at your desk or your kitchen table or wherever it is, we know that Marina, we heard some of the sounds that she concretely heard, Cassius drumming. But do you use sound then as you actually sit down and write? Or do you prefer not to use sound? Or is there a sound just in your head? Or how is that physical practice of writing related to, or not, to sound? Maybe I'll start with you, Jessica Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz will use last names today.
All right. No, yeah, thank you. The last song that I played, Union Miari, I would put that song on to kind of bring myself back into a space, listening to the Alibs or landowners singing, and on Kwajalein in the military base. And there's a map that shows the different forcibly removed and relocated Marshallese populations that had to go through Kwajalein. And I would remember these movements. I would remember just so much came back to me. So that was one concrete sound. At other times, I would want to be in my own world and in the Marshallese, trying to hear the Marshallese language, which has its own relational milieu. I tried to think really a lot about the sounds of the lyrics, its prosody, musical, sonic, so on and so forth. But that necessitated, because I lived in apartments, that I had to put a sound machine on or put my air purifier up on maximum level to drown everything out and wear earplugs. So there was a lot of and that would be happening. So those are, I guess, to answer your question, the kind of two modalities that I would use. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz. Jessica Bissett-Perea.
Jessica 1, Jessica 2. Yeah, I think that just logistically, with two small children, I really appreciate Marina's sharing of your son's musicking, because I think that there is always sound. It's kind of, as a parent, you can't always escape sound, and so I think I've always been somebody who quiet is too eerie to me. Like, there has to be some kind of sound. But obviously, with the soundtrack not only shown in the discography of the book, which was really important to me to put at the beginning of the book as one of the front matter pieces, but also listening a lot to other Arctic indigenous music that was coming out at the time. For anybody who has spent any amount of time with me, you know that I'm also like obsessed with Tanya Tagaq's work, as well as just there's some immense, amazing work coming out of Canada that to me is also very much related politically in terms of the kinds of consciousness raising that musicians are doing, but also not just consciousness raising, but calling us to act and to do something, right? So in addition to kind of the Alaska Native or Yupik Inuit music that I was focusing on and just listening to keep myself grounded continually in what it was about the sound that was important to convey as well as I can in this first 10-year book, was also just trying to continually keep up and listening to other things that are coming out of the Arctic, because so much I think of like the image of the Google, you know, what the algorithm wants you to think about the Arctic has real ramifications for the kinds of sounds that we do or don't know about or hear or are exposed to. So for me, writing has to be a sounded practice. There has to be soundings happening for me. Otherwise, I start worrying that it's a little too quiet, you know, like before Jaws comes out of the water or something. So that's how I tend to think about it when I'm actually doing the writing.
Thank you. What about you, Marina? Besides,
I can't listen to something when I'm writing. It's too distracting. To sound is, I mean, it requires attention, and in a way that even, I mean, it's not like I always say listen to something attentively, but I can't do something like writing that I'm also having to focus on. So I don't listen while I'm writing.
Can I flip this question to Nina? I feel like, Nina, having formulated this question, I'm sure that you have a really interesting answer to it for your own writing practice.
I wrote you in the chat that I'm going to post it to you now, Martin. So you... Okay, I have different things. I'll answer super quickly. And this came up another time and in another soundtrack to creativity, and it appeared then that I have a secret soundtrack that I will not share with anybody, that I use to get myself, I think like Jessica, like to get myself ready. I don't always use it, but if I sometimes I need it to just, it's like a trigger in a way. And it's just the same few pieces that I've been using for years and years and years. And there's nothing special about them. That's why I don't want to share it, because it's not like it's those pieces. It's just somehow they became those pieces. Has no connection thematically or sonically, I think, to what I'm writing about necessarily. But if all music is an intermediary vibrational practice, it has as much relation as anything else. So that's the thing. Yeah, that's what I'll answer. I also just
now I really want to find out what those pieces are.
Excuse me?
Now I really want to find out what those pieces are.
I know.
Knowing that you won't tell us is just really makes it really all very tantalizing.
But Martin, how about you?
God, I only have two thoughts in response to the question. One is that I've been doing a lot of writing recently in an unrelated project on the auditory imagination. And so there, you know, the whole project is this kind of impossible project of attempting to listen inward to the sounds that, you know, that one is hearing in one's imagination, memory, and anticipation, and to document them and to treat them as if, to treat the sounds that I hear in my head as if they are, you know, worthy, you know, as any music, like to treat the music I hear in my head as if it's music, to assume that it's music and therefore that it's worthy of documentation. And so then to attempt to kind of fix this unfixable, you know, Quicksilver kind of object creates its own really massive challenges that can only be imperfectly addressed. So that's one thing. It's just this you know, the soundtrack is produced by me noiselessly. And then the other thought that I had was, I remembered when I was working on my book on the centrality of sound and listening to people's experience of the Iraq War, I went to Iraq and I recorded, I made a large number of sound recordings of military vehicles and gunfire and other, wind and birds and water and, you know, voices, kind of everything that I managed that I could possibly capture. And then I was using those sounds with a team from USC that was creating a virtual reality therapeutic program for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I found myself at this one moment of the project in a very sophisticated sound studio with really powerful monitors and my recordings of gunfire, trying to see if I could get them loud enough so that they felt like I remembered the actual event feeling, with the kind of pain response that the actual event created. And I ended up giving myself hearing loss, like through the, kind of very acutely, but lastingly through that experience. So the kind of sounds of warfare, sounds that I've always argued are more than sounds because they're kind of impossible to disentangle from the violent acts that produce them, ended up, as I was writing about them, being simultaneously a text and a force that that impacts your body and is a manifestation of violence on your body. Even those mediated kind of traces of those sounds that were more than sounds ended up, damaging me. So that, that was my soundtrack, this very kind of super avoidable, like I regret it every day, kind of attempt to create verisimilitude, ended up kind of coming to haunt me. That's a kind of a downer note on which to end this thing on sound.
No, I didn't know, Martin. Is it? Yeah, it's you did your research.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And thank you so much for co-hosting this event with me. I'm thinking back to Martin kindly invited me to Abu Dhabi many years ago when we were listening to Scorpions. We went to the desert. What were we listening to? Scorpions, dogs, goats?
Yeah. We did, Nina and I did, we performed a play for a non-human audience of scorpions and lots of insects, and a play called A Voice Cries Out in the Desert, right? It was, who is it? It was Jean-Luc Nancy, right?
Nancy, yes.
Who wrote it. He wrote this play, Vox Clamans in Deserto, and we decided that since it was like, since it kind of evoked this kind of, emptiness and desert-like state, that, and since we were at the empty quarter on the border of Saudi Arabia, that we would just kind of perform it together. To date, my favorite performance, bar none. Another unrecorded performance. That one goes in the Analog Humanities Archive.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Well, this event it's recorded and it will go up on, if it's okay with all the speakers, I'll talk with you afterwards, up on the Peer Lab archive. So if you, any of you want to share this with your students or refer to it later, it will hopefully be there. And I wanted to thank everybody for being here tonight or this afternoon or whichever time zone you're in. It's been very special to share this time and space and atmosphere with all of you. And a special thank you to Martin, of course, who co-hosted this event with me, and to Jessica and Marina for sharing these really intimate aspects of your creative process. And I've also been really loving seeing what people have shared in the chat in terms of what they're listening to. So please spend the last few moments sharing that. And if you go to our Instagram page, maybe Jordan, you can post that link. We can do a little post there and people can continue to share what they're listening to when they're making work or just thinking or doing. We can keep that conversation going there. And it's very important for me to also thank the UCLA School of Music and the Peer Lab teams, those two teams who have been working behind the scenes to make this event possible. Their low hands and brains and hearts behind just even a little event like this. And finally, I do have a very important message, which is that these books, we're lucky to have discount codes for them. And I believe the Duke discount code, I believe the last day for that is tomorrow. So just buy it right now. And I think Jessica Bizet-Perea's might be lasting a bit longer. But it's a really great opportunity to read this important work. And I just wanted to close out by saying that if you want to say hi, we'll stay back here for a few minutes. If you want to just say hi to the authors, feel free to unmute your camera and your voice. We'll just hang out here. And thank you again so much for coming, and have a wonderful day, evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Please do read these books and review them and rate them on the different, platforms where they can be found. They really deserve as wide an audience as possible.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Nina, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.